Welcome back. Hope you had a nice discussion with your team. We are going to shift gears and focus on decision points and options for returning to school in the context of the current pandemic and addressing the needs of our students in this important time. So we discussed earlier that before the pandemic, systems faced this triple squeeze that complicated transformation efforts. We had a higher bar for student learning, significant needs, all of which have been exacerbated both by pandemic-related issues and by the economic and social context in which we're living today. We have unsustainable cost structures and we have flat or declining revenue in many places. And all of that is made more complex by new student need that is emerging due to learning loss over the last several months. We have new physical distancing requirements and we have new financial pressure due to likely revenue declines, many of which were already hitting state and local coffers. So to respond to these greater student needs, we need to be investing in several important areas. We've got to be assessing student learning, social emotional needs. We've got to do the differentiation and new time and attention and programming that are required and that you've been discussing in prior sessions. And we need to think about social emotional support for students as well as for educators. And we recognize we also have imperatives around physical distancing that will complicate the ways in which we come back to school. So over the last 6 to 8 weeks at ERS, we've been working on really trying to learn as much as we can about what options are in front of us and developing some tools and resources to help school and system leaders design solutions that are right for them and for their students. And so we're going to touch on several of the tools and resources here and then point you to them for when we wrap up this work, so you'll be able to access everything that's here. We're going to take a pretty quick spin through, and so it'll be important that you have access to all of this when we wrap the session. So most districts and schools are considering an array of comeback models for the fall, and broadly speaking, these fall into 3 categories. There's in-person, which is what we know best. Students attend school in a school building every day. There's the idea of a hybrid model, where students attend school both in person and remotely, and they do so based on an established, predictable schedule. And then there's remote school, which is what we experienced in the spring, where students attend school from home or some other location. They use their laptops and the internet to engage in instruction, which might be synchronous with an educator or asynchronous, where it's done independently. In any scenario, we know we have a complex set of factors to work through. We are addressing the needs, academic and social emotional needs that we've described. We need to provide support and prepare teachers for multiple contexts. We need to think about technology, about equity, about the types of programming and staff that we need. There's just a lot of factors that come into play, no matter what scenario we're planning for. Quickly, I just want to align our language to what the Tennessee Department of Education has provided through their guidance. So TNDOE provided 4 categories for return to school. Their category 1 is in person. There's multiple options included there, but all of them we would consider in-person instruction with students physically in school buildings. Option 2 is all remote, students participating in virtual and distance learning. And then the models 3 and 4 are basically all hybrid models in some form, and there's different pieces of that, different variants of that we'll discuss. So to that point, hybrid can mean a lot of different things, and it was one of the biggest areas of learning for us as we unpacked what it looks like. And some of the ways in which hybrid models can vary are thinking about schedules. So are students coming every other day, every other week, or they're 2-day cycles, where they're in and out of school during a week? What does student grouping look like? And we'll talk a little bit about this idea of a homeroom, where students work in a cohort, or a split schedule, where students might work in a cohort, but their days look different depending on if they're in school or not. And then there's the role of the teacher, who may need to be teaching in person, may need to be teaching remotely, may need to be doing both, and may even be asked to do both simultaneously. But what all of these factors have in common, and all hybrid models have in common, is a belief that it is better for at least some students to be in person some of the time than for any student who wants to be in school in person to have to be remote all of the time. Now, as with any set of decisions, there are resource trade-offs involved. And so it is entirely possible that you and your system might determine that the trade-offs aren't worth realizing that belief. But that's the basic grounding of a hybrid model, is that we want kids to be in school, as many kids as much as we can, even if it's not everyone and it's not all the time. So let's delve in briefly into this idea of homeroom versus split. This turns out to be one of the biggest and most interesting decisions about the hybrid modeling work that we've done. And I'd like you to consider for a moment a classroom of 28 kids, and in this case, 12, the purple ones here, are in person and the remainder are working remotely. So in a traditional homeroom structure, those kids would travel together from class to class, or the class would come to them, as the case may be, regardless of whether they're in person or remote. So the simplest way to do this, in some ways, from a resource standpoint, would be just to have a single educator running that classroom. We're asking that educator to manage in-person and remote students simultaneously, which is a new challenge. So one solution to that might be, well, let's put 2 educators in the classroom. The second one maybe doesn't even need to be certified. And we could potentially increase the group size a bit, but generally speaking, 2 educators with a class of 26 or 28 kids is the kind of thing that we always would have, in many cases, would have loved to do. And often the resource levels create a constraint that make it difficult to do that. And so there's yet this other option of what we call a split schedule, or what you do on your A day and what you do on your B day, your in-person versus your remote day as a student, would vary. You'd have a different schedule. And so you'd be working with different teachers on those days. And potentially we could group larger groups of kids on the remote day to try to make this a little bit more efficient to operate with the resource constraints that we have. As you can imagine, the experience of the students and the experience of the teachers in each of these 3 options, the 1 educator homeroom, the 2 educator homeroom, or the split, look very different. And so the resource implications are significantly different as well. So as I mentioned, we've developed some comeback models, as we call them, so far. There's 6 on our website. I want to talk about 2 of them, but you'll note here that each one is a different combination of who's in person, who's remote, or where there's a hybrid where the same students are attending school in person or remotely, depending on the day, along an established and predictable schedule. So I'd like to just draw on model 1 and model 3 briefly to make a couple of comparisons. Let's start with model 1. And in model 1, this is an elementary school model where our kindergarten through 3rd grade students are fully in person and our 4th and 5th graders are fully remote. So we're going to walk through the logic of why it is that that's the trade-off that was made. So in this example school, and this is a hypothetical school, it turns out that to get all kids in person with physical distancing that is expected or planned for, in this case, 70% of kids, gen ed and inclusion students, can be in the school building. And so the way we get to that is by considering, well, who are the staff that can be with students in person? And in this school, there's 31 certified staff and 8 teaching assistants who we think can be in charge of a student group at any given time. And then we think about what, with physical distancing, is the group size that's required for in person. And we're assuming, based on the configuration of the school building and the rules in place in this area, the planning is for 13 kids in a group. And so the question becomes, with 39 instructional staff, how many kids can you support in person with what type of remote staffing, given what you need to do for in-person staffing? And it turns out in this particular case, with a group size of 13 for in-person, if you're willing to go for a 28 students to teacher ratio for remote instruction, you can support just over 70% of kids in the school building, or about 4 out of the 6th grade levels. And in this example, the school leaders have determined we would like to have 70% of our kids in person all the time and develop a remote model for everybody else. So how do they do that? Well, the first thing we think about is staffing required to support in-person versus remote instruction. And so the way we get to small group sizes, if all of our kindergartners, first, second, and third graders are in person, is we staff those grade levels really heavily. So instead of just having the usual 4 homeroom teachers at each grade, we add 4 other staff, TAs, interventionists, librarians, specialist teachers. And that allows us to create these smaller group sizes. The trade-off is that For our remote kids, we have larger group sizes, in this case 25, and we have one homeroom teacher who is charged with providing all the specials instruction for all 4th and 5th graders. And there's departmentalization happening here to enable this to go forward effectively. I want to name here also, we've maintained 2 self-contained classrooms for students with disabilities that require a substantially separate setting, each staffed with a teacher and a para, separate from everything else that we have. So this is an example of what the trade-off associated with staffing in person for small group sizes means you might have to make a trade and have other students working remotely with larger group sizes. Let's now look at elementary model 3, and in this case, the example is one where every student who wants it is in a hybrid model where they come to school about half the time. And in this case, the schedule is split, and that's how this school makes the model work with the constraints on resource levels. So in this case, you've got staffing for students to come in with group sizes of 14 on their in-person day. And to do that, given the size of the school, we have 3 teachers working at each grade level over the course of the day. And then we have our remote days, which are led by different teachers. In this case, one teacher with a core background, interventionist or librarian, and one non-core teacher together. And so this is what the group sizes look like for the time that teachers are with their students on any given day. Remember, students are only in school every other day. So the 80 students, 40 who are in school are in group sizes of 13 or 14 with their teachers, and the 40 who are not in school are in group sizes of 40 to 1, at least ratios of 40 to 1, with their pair of other teachers. And again, we have 2 self-contained classrooms reserved. So we can think about what does the day look like for a student on a remote day. And an in-person day, we can imagine what that schedule is like. It may look a lot like what in-person school looks like, but on a remote day, it looks a little bit different. So we mentioned that there's 2 teachers leading most of the instruction, in this case, an art teacher and an interventionist. There's also an ELL teacher assigned to provide support across multiple grades the course of the day. And so the remote day in this case for students are 6 hours long, of which 4.5 hours is directly with educators. And those are the ones shaded in that orange, yellow color. And then of that time, 3.5 hours are core instruction. In this case, we have asked our art teacher to become comfortable and supported to deliver ELA instruction over the course of the day. And our interventionist is focusing on math instruction. And then there's time for English language development as well as independent time. Now, those are 2 individual school examples, but the trade-offs you make could happen across the whole system. And this is what district leaders are focusing on right now, is thinking about, well, what do I want to do at different levels in different schools? And so here's an example of what a system-wide view could look like for these COVID comeback models. In this case, elementary schools all offer hybrid models that are split, like the Model 3 we just looked at, and kids who want to be remote get to be remote, that's the green. In middle school, the district has said, let's let families decide, and kids who don't want to come to school will set up a single remote middle school that cuts across more than one traditional school. And then for high schools, the focus is on 9th graders being in person, and then a remote option for everybody else. And you can imagine any number of permutations of this, but we're trying to make the trade-offs from across the system to ensure that we can support students as best we can, given physical distancing requirements, community preference, operational issues, and resource constraints. So that brings us to the overall process for developing these models. And it got complicated for us. We tried to boil it down to a process that others could follow, and that we would follow if we were starting over again. And this is what it looks like. Step 1 is about establishing guiding principles. You need a touchstone that you and your community members can lean on in making your decisions. And many communities are past this point already, but if not, it's a good thing to be starting with. And then we go to the process of identifying, well, which students need to be in person, either because they have particular needs or they aren't able to access remote instruction, and which students are going to be fully remote, often because they choose to. their families say, we're not ready to send our child to school. There's a whole set of operational data that you're going to need to gather as well. We focused so far on physical distancing and maximum class sizes, but there are also issues around transportation and entry and exit of the buildings that may further limit the number of kids and adults you can have in the school building at any time if you're planning for physical distancing. And armed with that information, you can plan for what is a combination of models you want to prioritize across the system, or if you're doing it within your school, across your school. And once you have a sense of what those models might be, you can actually design the schedules and staffing models. And again, our comeback models are designed to provide examples of what this could look like going forward. So before we go to our second discussion, I want to just refer to the fact that all of this is available on our website. It's erstrategies.org, which you can see here. And right on the homepage, there's a link for exploring our COVID-19 resources. And that will get you to everything that we have described here. Also, before we wrap, I want to name that this is just a really challenging time for everybody. The work you are doing as school leaders and school team members is so critical and uniquely challenging and difficult for this moment in time. And we are just very grateful for all that we see happening all over the country and all over the state of Tennessee to figure this out. As part of that process, we are learning too. And so at the bottom of that same page that you'll click through to on our website, there's a link to take a short survey if you're up for it. We'd welcome your feedback. What's working for you? What's not working for you? What do you want to know more about? That is incredibly helpful information for us. And of course, through the folks at University of Tennessee and Dr. McIntyre, you can provide feedback and ideas and questions as well. So with all of that, let's send you off to your discussion. And here's the guiding question. What are some of the choices that you are considering right now for organizing your resources to best meet student needs when you return to school? And some of the factors that encourage you to consider in this conversation are what you're hearing from your community, their need and preferences, what kind of physical distancing requirements you might need to plan for, how you want to think about in-person versus remote school, where you feel like you have an option to do the best you can for kids with the challenges and the constraints that you face. Where can you be flexible? Where can you be creative? Where can you rethink the way we do school and think about it differently? And any other local context that affects your community particularly. As a last note before you go into this conversation, I just want to name that as we talk to leaders in schools and systems all over the country, one thing that is clear is just how uncertain the times are, right? From a day-to-day and a week-to-week basis, the health situation, the economic situation, the educational situation changes, and it changes from community to community. And so the thing I would encourage you to do as you go through this process is to operate with the best information you have, recognize that it is going to be imperfect, and make some plans for what scenarios you might think are likely or potential to come forward. And that means that there's going to be some wasted work. You're going to plan for some things that won't happen. But I think the thing that is most concerning for us is, in what we see, is leaders who are paralyzed and aren't able to move forward. And the thing that we find most inspiring in the conversations we're having is to see folks really going down the path of thinking through what they can do to support kids in any number of scenarios, particularly ones that they think are likely given their local context. So with that, thank you again. Really grateful for your work, grateful to be part of the conversation, and very excited to hear after these sessions how your discussions have gone, and looking forward to tracking progress in the state.